Hi, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Boerne Book and Arts Festival. Thank you for joining us. This year is quite a bit different. We are all online and all virtual this year. Hopefully in 2021, we will be back at Main Plaza. Just a few notes before I turn this over to Steve Davis. If you haven't ordered books yet and would like to, please do so. Sometime before tomorrow evening. I'm going to try to get our book orders into our vendors before tomorrow evening. If you don't see your favorite book by your favorite author on our website, email me and we will try to get that book for you, definitely. But we do have the featured titles on the website. And a percentage goes back to the library on those sales. Also, all of our authors have been gracious to sign book plates for us. So we have a really nice Boerne Book and Arts Festival book plate that is signed by each author that we'll include with your book. And for today, I'm going to introduce Steve Davis, who's going to run the interview with SC Gwynne. And thanks to both of the gentlemen for joining us today. If you do have any questions, we're going to save the questions until about 15 minutes before the session closes. So just kind of hold off on your questions until then. And then, so I'm going to just introduce Steve. Steve Davis is curator for the Wittliff collection, and he is nice enough to do this interview for us. He helped us out last year with Steve Harrigan. In addition to being curator at the Wittliff collections, Steve Davis is also the editor and author of many books, including the latest, The Essential J. Frank Dobie, and also Dallas 1963, several others, great books. So thank you very much, Steve, for doing the interview for us today.
Thanks for inviting me, Karen. It's great to be part of the Boerne Book Festival again this year, and I'm glad we're able to at least do it virtually. Temperature's a little more comfortable than it was last year when I thought it was like 100 degrees out there. So
it was bad.
That in any case. And it's my pleasure to visit with Sam Gwynne about his new book. And I want to say that SC Gwynne probably needs very little introduction for this audience, but I do want to say that I first became aware of his work in the early 2000s when his writing started appearing in Texas Monthly. He was doing great stories on politics and football and business, the environment, and the outdoors. And I still remember the story that just pierced through everything else, and I think it's a classic story in Texas Monthly. That's Conversations with the Grasshopper. Sam's trip to the Solitario. Just brilliant stuff. And so when I was reading these things, I didn't realize at that time that Sam had already published 2 acclaimed books on banking, that he had been an international banker. He had graduated from Princeton and gotten a master's degree in writing from Johns Hopkins. He'd been an award-winning investigative reporter and a bureau chief for Time magazine. So there's this whole history to Sam that a lot of us in Texas didn't know about. And then, of course, coming to Texas in 2010, he published his Empire of the Summer Moon, a huge bestseller, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, a book that's really viewed as a modern classic. It's kind of a cultural phenomenon in a lot of ways. He's published 3 additional books since then, all highly regarded, and we're here today to talk about his newest, which you can see behind Karen, and actually I have it here in my shelf of honor, Hymns of the Republic, the story of the final year of the American Civil War. So Sam, it's great to have you here. And,
it's great talking to you.
And so let me ask first, just tell us about the title, Hymns of the Republic.
Well, Hymns of the Republic was, it's a play on Battle Hymn of the Republic, which is a familiar name. There was, at some point I became aware in my research of something that was known as the Black Battle Hymn of the Republic. It was sung by slaves and Black Americans. And I don't know, the idea just sort of suggested to me that there were other hymns, that there were hymns of different constituencies and people. And what I I meant by that, I guess, is by looking at this last year of the war, which is what the book is about. It was meant to be a look at different sort of pieces of that war, and not say just the Union Army or something like that. So that was the general idea.
Yeah, and that definitely comes through the pieces of the war. And I want to get to that in a moment. But let me ask first, this is your second book on the Civil War. You earlier authored an account of Stonewall Jackson. Just talk to us a bit about how you got interested in the Civil War.
The way I got interested was two simple words: Bruce and Catton. For those of you, some of you may be familiar with Bruce Catton. He was sort of the guy who popularized the Civil War. He was the guy that made everybody say, "We just love reading about the Civil War," and even more so, I think, than other people who were roughly contemporaries. Well, Shelby Foote came a little bit later, but Douglas Southall Freeman, Shelby Foote, these were, but Catton was the great popularizer. And, he had books like Mr. Lincoln's War and Stillness at Appomattox. These were big bestsellers. And so I guess I was in early adulthood when I read Bruce Catton, and it was kind of so many books about the Civil War are like the bullet by bullet account of what went on, and like what the 23rd North Carolina was doing at 9:43 a.m. It's extremely detailed battle stuff, which is fine, and I sort of like to read that stuff, but it's not entertaining. It's not a great narrative, and Catton wrote a great narrative, and in fact, the book that I wrote was, when I sort of decided to do the last year of the war, I thought it might be an interesting way to kind of narrow the aperture. And I looked back and I thought, well, I wonder how many people have done that in the last, 50 or 60 years. And the answer was one: Bruce Catton. Stillness at Appomattox. He won the Pulitzer in 1954 with it. So anyway, it's a long-winded way of saying that's how I got interested in the war. And I just always found it the most compelling thing in American history. To me, nothing's even a close second to it. It's definitive of our nation. It's dramatic beyond your wildest dreams. It is complex beyond your wildest dreams, and just a wonderful thing to write about. So for me, it was, I happened to choose for my first subject Stonewall Jackson, and part of this has to do with the writing business, I guess. As you said, I was lucky enough with Empire of the Summer Moon to have a bestseller. And it's a big bestseller. I think we've sold 1.7 million so far. So, a lot of copies. And most writers are not lucky enough to have that. There are plenty of really good books that don't do that. But anyway, I got lucky. And so when you get lucky like that, a window opens, if however briefly. And that window is, you can pretty much kind of do what you want on the next book, as long as you're not, going to go write a fantasy novel about the frozen moons of Jupiter, which would not be fun. But if you're sticking to American history. And so really, I thought, I had some other ideas, but at some point I thought, okay, if I could just do anything I wanted to do, what would that be? And I came very quickly, pretty much to two names: Ulysses S. Grant and Stonewall Jackson. And I thought Grant had been a little overdone. It's still every year there's 20 books on Grant. But so that's how I got to the Civil War. It's like, I can probably do what I want to, at least this one time. So that's what happened.
Okay, and this book clearly grew out of that, which we can get into. But I want to just get quickly to this idea of your sort of narrative style in this book. I came into this thinking, well, what am I going to learn that's new and fresh about the Civil War? And I think what was new and fresh was the whole book, because of the way that you choose to write about it. And as you sort of alluded to, it's not necessarily a bullet by bullet account of each battle, but we're really learning about the personalities of the people who were, of major consequence during the war, and we're learning about them in ways that feel very fresh. And I want to just quote a little bit from this review that I came across in Civil War magazine. This begins: in the aftermath of the war, Herman Melville published battle pieces and aspects of war, Years later, Walt Whitman released Specimen Days. For many writers, it seemed that the best way to tell the war story was through specific moments in lives. S.C. Gwynne, in his lyrical and masterful Hymns of the Republic, follows in that tradition. So I think, here you are being compared to Melville and Whitman in your approach.
I'll take it, man.
and that was a deliberate, not to mimic, to be compared to them, but to take that kind of more literary approach in some ways.
Yeah, the Civil War, as you say, is the first question you have to answer is what are you bringing to the party? Because I don't know, 680 biographies of or books about Ulysses Grant. I mean, there's no shortage of stuff out there. There's just whole buildings full of Civil War stuff. So the idea, at some level, is to try to cut through and to try to make fresh observations somehow, to try to step back from that awesome burden of having to really look at the battles up close. Now, I did some of that in my Stonewall Jackson book. The reason for that is because here was possibly the most brilliant military commander in history. So you kind of do have to look at the battles. You have to look at his Valley campaign, and you kind of do have to follow it pretty closely, because otherwise how can you establish his genius? But here I wanted to step back a little bit and write a narrative, but also I wanted to. We have a wonderful writer here in Austin named Lawrence Wright, who I know you know well, Larry has a great configuration, or a great sort of explanation of how he structures his narratives. He said, well, the first thing you got to find is a donkey. He said, well, what's a donkey? Well, a donkey is the thing that carries the narrative, right? And the donkey is a person, and that the person can be anybody, but it has to carry the narrative. You have to really be involved in that person in order to do it. And I agree with that. In other words, so what I did with this book is I tried to, in this case, is because I'm sweeping through an entire year, there are going to be different donkeys. There's going to be, I hate to use the word, it's Larry's word, not mine, by the way. Robert E. Lee at one point is, Clara Barton at one point is this great Black journalist from Philadelphia is another one. Salmon P. Chase is another, the weird genius / incompetent Ben Butler is another. And just trying to have these guys, as we move through the thing, carry that narrative along in a way that what I hope makes sense to the reader of what's going on.
Yeah, and when I was reading it, I got this. Well, I want to talk about the beginning chapter because it really sets up the book so nicely. And what happens is that the various characters introduced, from Clara Barton, the battlefield, the angel of the battlefield, the great nurse, to the Black soldiers, to the great Confederate strategists who bedeviled the North, to the incompetent Union generals, all of those. At first, they feel like there's kind of individual portraits, but then they start kind of meshing together to sort of collaboratively tell the story that final year. But the way the book begins is you take us into Washington. I believe is it March 1864, and you sort of describe what the Capitol is like at that time, and we just sort of feel like we're like really on the front row of history there. And you describe the arrival of U.S. Grant into the Capitol. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's this wonderful move. So I set it up by talking about the kind of social world that's going on inside Washington and of that season, and the presidential receptions and levees and all these huge parties. And one of the reasons was that Washington is this very small and by American standards somewhat inconsequential city. It's only started to be built. The Washington Monument is kind of a stub, unfinished, sitting there. The Capitol hasn't been finished yet. There's, the sanitation is terrible. Anyway, but there's this kind of social world of that season. And one of the reasons is because there's some hope finally for the North in the war. This hope is about to be dashed very badly, but there's a little bit of hope. And one of the big components of this hope is the arrival in Washington of Ulysses S. Grant, the great victor of the West. And the Union generals in the first part of the war were basically a disaster, and it was a chain of disasters. It was one incompetent after another, one general after another, George McClellan probably being the most famous, but who flushed away, you know, the northern advantages of troops and men and material and everything else. And yet here was this other guy who was the victor at Fort Donelson and Henry, and the victor at Shiloh, and the victor at Vicksburg especially, you know, and the victor at Chattanooga. And this was a general who fought hard and didn't back off and didn't lose. Okay, so finally he's arriving, and this is the moment that I choose. He finally arrives, and it's a great story because it tells you how different the world was. Grant arrives at Union Station in Washington, and because he's Grant, when George McClellan, the incompetent Union general of a few years before, arrived somewhere, you know, he would have 40 coaches and livery and, 100 suitcases and whatever. This was Grant arrives with his son, Fred, who's 13, and his assistant. That's it. And so Grant gets off the train, and he's standing there in Union Station waiting to be picked up by somebody. And by the way, he's coming to Washington to accept a commission that only George Washington, only two generals before it, including Washington, had ever given, that lieutenant general, 3-star general, right? Anyway, so there he is in Union Station. He's looking around. Nobody's come to pick him up because of logistical error. So he finally decides he's going to go over to the War Department, where his boss is, Halleck, and he takes a cab over there, and Halleck's not there. So then he goes back to Halleck's home to take, again, in the cab over to Halleck's home. Halleck's not there either. So having tried 3 times now to find somebody who would welcome him, he's been told, somebody had told him that Willard's Hotel was the place where he could go, where he had a reservation rather. So Grant goes to Willard's Hotel, which is, the kind of the happening place. Still there, it's called the Willard now, called Willard's back then, but happening place in Washington, a few blocks from the White House. He walks in unrecognized. And one of the reasons he's unrecognized is because he's never been in the East. He went to West Point. His whole career has been in the West, a military career in California, and then later on in what we call, well, back then they called the West, but the Midwest. He's a Western guy. Nobody knows what he looks like. And it's interesting because here's a man who is so famous. He's more popular than Lincoln. He's had millions of words and ink expended on him. He's got full-length paintings of him hanging over in Congress. Just one of them, a huge one. He's got his hand on a destroyed Confederate cannon. Anyway, walks into the Willard unrecognized. He and Fred go upstairs. They come down for dinner. He seats himself at dinner, unrecognized. Now, remember, the level of fame we're talking about here is if Barack Obama and Lady Gaga walked into the Willard. Now, one would recognize them, I think. This is the level of his fame. No one recognizes him. He comes down for dinner. Anyway, long story short, eventually the people in the dining room begin to realize who he is. And eventually the place goes completely crazy, but nowhere near as crazy as the White House went an hour later when he shows up there. It's a riot. It's a riot with ladies trying to touch him. And at one point, Seward is the Secretary of State and takes Grant up on a sofa to get away from them. But the reason for all this is because Grant was coming to save the Union. And this is what it was going to be. And in people's mind, it was going to be not single combat precisely, but idea of single combat. The great Confederate indomitable genius of the East, Lee, was going to meet the great Union genius of the West in single combat, if you will, in Northern Virginia, or in Virginia. And this was going to be definitive, and the war was going to be over, and people believed that. So this is my opening chapter is kind of try to capture this moment in time when everything seemed to hang in the balance, and everything indeed was in the balance.
Yeah, and ironically, it was just a short time after that the Confederates almost took Washington, D.C.
Yeah, no, they were right at the. In fact, if they had had a little more intelligence, they could have marched right into the Capitol. But yeah, so it was very, and also Washington in those days, as I write, was the most heavily defended city on earth. I mean, there were, you know, 50 forts around it and 60,000 men, and it was the most. It was like a medieval kind of almost fortification, and with good reason, because Lee and Jackson had twice been come very close to it before. And anyway, so it's this like, okay, and this is how my year. I'm writing about the last year of the war, so it opens with Grant's arrival to get the commission as Lieutenant General in March of '64, and well, Appomattox is roughly a year later, April '65, but that's pretty much the year. So that's how my year starts. Grant and Lee are about to go to battle.
And, you know, I have about the average amount of ignorance about the Civil War. So there are a lot of things, you know, I didn't realize until reading your book, but I guess I never realized exactly how endangered Abraham Lincoln's re-election prospects were, and how dependent they were on how Grant and his generals performed on the battlefield.
Yeah, it was interesting. So when you have the beginning of these battles that I was talking about between Lee and Grant, and they're famous, it's called the Overland Campaign, but people, I think almost everybody would know the names of those battles, you know, Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, you know, Petersburg. I mean, these were those battles, the bloodiest time of the Civil War. So one of the interesting things is that Civil War is it's so maddeningly complex, sometimes even to get at a single simple truth. It's very hard to do. Everything's relativistic in the world of the Civil War. But in the spring of 1864, there was absolute clarity on both sides about what the war was about, certainly the campaign in Virginia, what it was about. It was about one man, Abraham Lincoln. And the idea was that if the North won, then Lincoln would win in November, because there was an election in November. And if Lincoln won in November, the war would be prosecuted till the end. And that was a one-way street for the South. They didn't have the men or the wealth to keep it going. If, on the other hand, Lee won, then the idea was Lincoln would lose, and it would almost certainly be a Democrat who would almost certainly have gotten there because he had promised peace on some level, and there would be a negotiated some kind of peace. Okay, so we start the year, it's all about one man. And partly because of this, you have this, all these prodigious attacks on Lincoln that year, but the great revolt against him comes from inside his own party, from the radical Republicans, who, Salmon P. Chase being my donkey there, who just basically hate him. I mean, Lincoln, if you were to look at Lincoln in August of 1864, he was just the most hated. You couldn't find a single person to say anything nice about him, certainly not inside his own party. He was universally reviled. People gave him no chance of being reelected. If you just take a snapshot, which I do in the book, of August of 1864, it is everybody moving against Abraham Lincoln from within his party, from outside the party, every single conceivable way in order to get rid of him. And anyway, it is interesting how sometimes history simplifies itself into a single person.
Yeah, and you know, it was really also fascinating to read about the African-American soldiers who were fighting for the North, and then the belated attempt by the Confederacy to perhaps, you know, recruit some slaves to fight for them. Can you talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time on black soldiers in the book, and it's interesting. The big picture is that the North had 180,000 black soldiers in the Union Army in the final year of the war. That's 10% of the Union Army was black. I mean, I had forgotten that maybe, and then I relearned it, and it still kind of shocks me. You don't think that it's that many. It really turned. It was critical and telling in what happened. But it was interesting. So when Lincoln frees the slaves, he makes the Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862, but they're not really freed until January officially, you know, until January of 1863. And when he issued the official proclamation, he added like a paragraph to it that changed American history, changed everything. It might have sounded innocent to some people, but what he said was, black soldiers can be combatants in the war. And not only that, but this was going to be encouraged. And in Lincoln's mind, that the really the arm, or the kind of the real hammer of emancipation, was going to be enlistment. Enlistment was going to be the way it was going to happen. Not only for escaped slaves, they would be taken into the army in large numbers as they were, but just African Americans in the North. It would be a black soldier was a very different thing than, well, certainly than a slave. I mean, think about a slave. A slave doesn't even have a name. A slave can't own a bank account. A slave can't do anything, has no legal rights. And suddenly, somebody crosses through a Union Union Army lines, and suddenly comes out on the other side, a man with a uniform and a salary. Now, they weren't treated very well. Leaving that aside for the moment, the fact is, as Frederick Douglass said, you put a gun in his hand, you give him money, you put a uniform on it, he's fighting for the United States. He's no longer a no-count slave, he is a soldier. And it's just this radical thing that happens in it. And so I'm writing about the last year of the war. This is when it really comes to bear, this enormous weight of black soldiers. And as I write in some detail in the book, it was not easy for these guys. They were not treated well by Northern officers. They were, they weren't paid fairly. They were abused. They were, in some cases, they were treated like slaves by the Northern officers. But this is, it was never going to be perfect anyway. But I mean, the fact was there was enormous.
And they acquitted themselves so well time and time again. I love the story you tell about the African-American soldiers being the first ones into Richmond.
This is such a great story. And I'll tell as quickly as I can. So we have, so it's Richmond is burning, Richmond is fallen. Richmond is the Confederate Army, and everybody is in the government has fled Richmond. This is April of 1865. And so what happens is Union soldiers approach from the east, and they're expecting to see what they usually see, which is trenches bristling with guns and things that you can't cross. And they realize there's no one there. They just walk right through these enormous, what were the biggest defenses probably ever mounted by anyone. Anyway, they come through, and there's a great moment. The first ones through are the 24th Corps, which is an all-black Army Corps. And they end up stopping about 3 miles east of the capital of Richmond. And there's this kind of moment where the mayor of Richmond, officially surrenders. And these slaves have come out, and the slaves can't believe their eyes. Didn't even know there was such a thing as a black soldier, and at all, let alone the first soldiers they see coming in. Anyway, there's this moment where there's one road from where these soldiers are into Capitol Square, into the center of Richmond. And it's very clear, and they all understand that the first infantry into the fallen, burning capital of the South is going to be the most glorious thing anybody ever did. Stories for their great-grandchildren, right? You're going to be everybody knows what that means. So there's a moment where we have to decide whether this black group is going to go in, or whether a white group that has arrived is going to go in. And of course, that's a no-brainer. The white guys are going to go in the context of the Union Army in 1865. And so the white guys take off down the road, bands playing or whatever, and with glory in their eyes. The black soldiers just won't accept this. So they take off. There's only one road. So they take off through field and farm and over stone walls. But they're so motivated that they get into the city, the center of the city, before the white soldiers do. And in fact, so much so that I think their band is sitting there playing when the white soldiers walk up. And the white soldiers are very upset about this. And in fact, a campaign has started right at that moment to discredit the black soldiers and to rewrite and revise the history so that it was the white soldiers who got there first. But fortunately, it turned out to be, history records that the black soldiers were the first. But one of the reasons that's true is that there was this black correspondent for a Philadelphia newspaper, Thomas Morse Chester, who was happened to be there. He had positioned himself there so he could see who the first soldiers were. And he wrote about who the first soldiers in were. And now when he was going to file that story to the Philadelphia Weekly, I guess, he was the only black correspondent of a major northern newspaper. Anyway, he was going to file the story in Philadelphia, so he repairs to the Confederate House of Representatives, where Chester is sitting in the speaker's chair, filing his story about who were the first soldiers into Richmond, when a Confederate officer who has been surrendered and paroled happens to walk in and sees him and is just outraged at this, and demands that Chester vacate the speaker's chair. Now Chester, looks up, continues filing. The Confederate officer charges him, whereupon Chester, who's a pretty big guy, just stands up and decks him. And the Confederate officer now is furious, and he goes to a brother Union officer and says, "Give me your sword so that I may thrash this man." I'm not exactly sure what he said, but the effect of that. The Union soldier declined and said, "I'll tell you what, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to give you my sword. But I'll tell you what, we'll clear out the floor of the Confederate house so you all can have a fight." And the Confederate officer declined. But when Chester was asked about it, they said, "Well, why'd you do that?" He said, "Obviously the day before he would have been executed for doing that." He said, I thought about it, and he said, I thought I would exercise my rights as a belligerent. So anyway, it was one of my favorite stories, and there are so many of them in the war.
Yeah, and I'm glad you sort of told that story, because that really is indicative of the kinds of stories that we get in this book. And he was such a great character in here. And of course, at that time, we've got Jefferson Davis and sort of his dwindling coterie of followers, fleeing across on the land, which is also a great story. And I was really struck by how you have such respect for the brilliance of the Confederate leaders like Robert Lee and the guerrilla fighter Mosby, who we didn't talk about. At the same time, there's a real kind of contempt that comes through for Jefferson Davis and sort of the political leadership. And
just terrible. He was a terrible person. I mean, he was like terrible. No matter how you want to rate a person, he was terrible. He was brittle, and he was vengeful, and he was also at the end unwilling to. I mean, he was just willing to sacrifice, thousands of his own people in order to keep some dream of the Confederacy alive, which was entirely his own self-indulgence. But I try to, when I write about Confederates, I try to, yes, they fought for slavery and so forth, but I mean, they were and granted, that's the general idea of the war here, but they're interesting folks, and they have complex lives, and so I think I'm a equal opportunity basher of both Union and Confederate generals.
Yeah, because you write about them as people, really, not from a ideological perspective so
right.
much. And well, we have a few minutes left before we get to the Q&A. And one of the things I wanted to ask about too is just, where I live in New Braunfels, like, one block over is Stonewall Street, right? And there's a plaque they put up just within the last 5 years, reminding everybody why it's named Stonewall Street, right? And
I didn't know that. This is in New Braunfels?
Yeah.
I didn't, or somehow that escaped my attention.
And
they put up saying they said it's named because of Stonewall Jackson, who was a Confederate.
Right. And it's an old part of town, so that street's been named Stonewall for a long time. But the sort of the edge, it's not a plaque, it's sort of in the concrete, there's like an engraved thing that reminds people, lets people know why it's named that. And just thinking about, of course, the controversy that's emerged over Confederate statues, just kind of what's your take on that? And just in light of everything that's happened, do you feel differently about Stonewall Jackson? Are you still able to kind of see him as this brilliant strategist, divorced from kind of the ethical perspective that he had and so forth?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I'm a Yankee, and when I first came here, And I was on the south lawn of the Capitol, and I saw that statue, which basically said that it was a statue of the Confederacy saying these boys died for states' rights, you know, and basically the old lost cause BS about how, you know, the war wasn't about slavery, you know, which, whatever. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe there was a statue on the lawn. Now, of course, I was a naive Yankee. I didn't understand. I didn't get that. So I mean, I come from a perspective that isn't, I mean, I'm not, in other words, if I'm allegedly being fair to Stonewall Jackson, it's not because I'm third generation daughters of the Confederacy or something, or sons of the Confederacy. But I've come to the conclusion, I came to it reluctantly initially because the historian in me said, I don't want to expunging something from history, to expunge the Confederacy so that no one would even know that it had happened. You just get rid of it. There's no evidence anywhere. That as a historian, that doesn't sit well with me. But I concluded pretty quickly that you cannot defend these statues. It's impossible to. There's no way you can. And therefore they have to either be sequestered somewhere or they have to be taken down. I just don't see. I had a really interesting conversation last summer, long conversation with Stonewall Jackson's great grandson, you know, who wrote a column in the Richmond paper advocating that the Jackson statue be taken down. I mean, even Jackson's heirs want that to happen. I also have a Yankee perspective on it in a different way. And that is that it's a very slippery slope. If what you say is that, well, if somebody owns slaves, then we got to take them down. Or if some 18-year-old kid whose family didn't even own slaves fought, let's say in a Georgia regiment, then you got to take him down. Okay, then you've got to start looking elsewhere too. I know everybody has a moral balance sheet, right? Who's good and who's evil, but I mean, 15 presidents owned slaves. 10 while in office. Ulysses S. Grant owned slaves. You know, Abraham Lincoln's wife was from a wealthy slave-owning family. If you go to where I'm from, the pure and pristine and morally wonderful Connecticut, right, in Massachusetts, we were the ones who essentially mounted and financed the slave trade. Newport alone launched 1,000 voyages to the Middle Passage, you know. So you'd have to go and take out all, if you're, by the way, the slave trade from the Middle Passage is way more heinous than what 98% of any Confederate ever did. Bolting people into 4-foot-high decks and for the passage across to sell them. This is what my people did, okay? So, you know, the biggest slave market in the country was in New York City. The people who financed it were, you know, J.P. Morgan and Aetna. These are the people, Aetna made its money insuring those things, those voyages. So, you know, and of course the Jefferson and Washington were major slave owners who fought and traded. I mean, Jefferson had sex with his underage. So I'm just saying, we can keep going here. I'm not going to keep going, but we can keep going. It's to pick out, say, Lafayette McLaws or some Confederate general and say, well, that statue has to come down. I agree. I'm not going to disagree with it. But there's a certain, I don't know, sanctimoniousness, particularly among people who are from where I'm from, that alleges and somehow believes that that we weren't responsible. So the most brilliant speech ever given was Lincoln's second inaugural. I mean, Gettysburg Address is good, no question. Second inaugural is just astounding. And what he says in that, he says, look, this is a sin of which we are all guilty. And no one was saying this, by the way. Everybody's pointing fingers back then, right? North, south, you're guilty, you're to blame, you're the slave. Lincoln says, no, we are all guilty. This is something wound around the core of, you know, of our nation's history. And that, you know, the way he interprets the Civil War, and I'm unable to quote him exactly, but essentially he's interpreting it as blood atonement for the sin of slavery, the national sin of slavery. And it's a national sin too. And so I don't know, I guess I advocate perspective when it comes to this. And it's also not ever as clear or clean as you'd like it to be. If you looked at Stonewall Jackson as a slave owner, which he was so much more enlightened than Thomas Jefferson. It's ridiculous. 3 of his slaves, as I write about in the book, he rescued from, people begged him to buy them to save them. Another one he gave his freedom to, and then when he got sick, financed his illness, which hardly anyone did. A woman came with his wife at his marriage, who had raised his wife, and they gave their sons their freedom. I mean, any way you might want to measure, he was an enlightened slave owner, certainly compared to a lot of U.S. presidents and everybody else. So what everybody wants to do is moral balance sheet is, yeah, Jefferson had all those slaves, yeah, and yeah, how could you write a document that said that all men are created equal? I mean, come on, that's just dripping with hypocrisy, right? But we go, oh, yeah, but okay, but he did so much good, so we're going to do the moral balance sheet, and yeah, but Jefferson did good. So on the other hand, Stonewall Jackson, well, he fought for the South, so he's a traitor. I mean, I kind of, those are simplistic arguments that I don't necessarily buy. I'm sorry I'm getting a little wound up here, but I do, particularly as a Yankee, as I don't have a dog in this hunt. I didn't grow up down here, but I can see hypocrisy and bullshit when I can recognize it when I see it. And anyway, the point is, no, I don't. But to answer your question, do I feel differently about Jackson? No, Jackson is just one way of looking at the war, and I tried to look at him objectively. I spent a lot of time looking at the war through the lens of black soldiers in the other, in Hymns of the Republic. That's another valid way of looking at the war, I think. But I think some people, occasionally I would run into an interviewer who expected me, I don't know, to devote pages and pages condemning Confederates in my Stonewall Jackson biography. That's not, I'm using him as a lens to look, through which to look at history. I'm not making value judgments and saying, yeah, well, he was not as bad as so-and-so, but worse than so-and-so. So I'm trying not to do that.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty clear to anybody who reads your books. I mean, they're human stories, and every human has good and evil and flaws and layers of complexity, and the way we relate to each other just magnifies all of that, particularly in times of crisis.
It does. And just one more note. I mean, I wrote a book about the Comanches, and essentially the book is a celebration of the brilliance of this tribe, which affected everything that happened around it in the United States. It was militarily, diplomatically, linguistically, and brilliant, culturally brilliant. On the other hand, they did all these brutal things. So I mean, I wasn't trying to, I wasn't condemning them for being brutal, which they were, or this is just what it was to me. It was the truth of the matter. So,
yeah, it's the story, not a catechism, I guess. And one other thing, I think maybe I have time for one more question. I wanted to get into this a little bit because it was so interesting to me. It was something I hadn't really ever thought about until reading your book, and that is that really it was the very success of Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee that managed to prolong this war long past the point the South should have kept fighting. Yeah. And as a consequence of their brilliance, the South suffered so terribly because of what was going on. That was such a great irony, really, to consider.
Yeah, I came up with a word for it and a term for it, which is the Lee paradox. It was the more Lee won, the more the South was destroyed. And at the end of the war, we're talking about destruction on a scale of not just, Sherman and people like Sheridan burning the Shenandoah Valley, and Sherman burning his way through Georgia and the Carolinas. Certainly there was that, but just the economic disaster that happened to the South. People starving to death, refugees on the road. I mean, it was, and so you have this great genius who, the more he wins, the more everything gets destroyed. And not only that, but it gets radicalized. So at the end, his victory, not only it unleashes these demons, from the South's point of view, 180,000 Black Union soldiers was a demon unleashed. The Fort Pillow massacre being the result of that. You had the unleashing of a guerrilla war. We've never seen this level of guerrilla fighting in border states, places like Missouri. Just brutal, and prison camps that had never existed before. These ungodly, and we've all heard of Andersonville, which was a southern prison camp, but Elmira in New York was exactly as bad, had a 1% less death rate. That was a Yankee prison camp. all this unleashed, all these demons unleashed by the South's failure to lose, or I say, Lee's failure to lose the war at the end. And indeed, Lee's, and then I'll close with this, Lee's greatest moment to me was, there's this, they've been chased, westward in Virginia, out toward Appomattox. And there's a moment where all sorts of people are advocating that the Confederate Army, what's left of it, take to the hills and just interminable guerrilla war. The model for that would have been John Singleton Mosby's just successful interminable guerrilla war in Virginia that no one could stop. You're going to take to the hills and do that. Jefferson Davis and his remaining cabinet all advocated that. A number of Lee's officers were advocating that. And Lee could have said, let's go to the hills. We're not going to surrender. Just going to keep fighting. And he didn't. He used the full moral weight of his office and his personality to say, no, we're not going to do that. And it would have been just the worst thing in the world for the country. But yeah, it's an interesting moment.
Yeah, yeah. The Lee paradox. So Karen, do we have questions that you want to?
Yes, we do. Can you hear me?
We can't see you, but we can hear you. Yes.
Okay, I'm trying to rectify that. Okay. So we had a few questions that came in through email. Here's the first one. While the Union and Confederate armies were engaged, were the Western American Indian tribes more or less ignored, or at least not as pressured by manifest destiny? And then, do you think there is a credible link between the North American Apaches, Comanches, and the American Indian cultures of Mexico? Two different questions.
Okay, so the first one, what happens, it's interesting. What happens, first of all, you do have some Native Americans fighting. One very famously was at Appomattox, prompting Lee to, what did Lee say? He said, at least there's one authentic or true American here at Appomattox. But I might answer that by focusing on what happened out in the Indian Territory, which was what we now call Oklahoma. And I wrote about this extensively in my book on the Comanches. And what happens is you basically have the disappearance from Indian country, that part of the nation, of anything that passed for federal authority. In other words, because everyone is, as you were saying, ignored. Yes, they were ignored because everybody was busy fighting. And so you had kind of the vanishing of federal authority. Both, when I say federal, I mean Union and Confederate federal authority, right? So if you're in Texas and Arkansas, it's, Confederate authority. Or Union authority in Oklahoma. And so this goes away, and what happens is it just unleashes this incredible war inside the Indian nations. Now, it was also true that, for example, I think Chickasaws, for example, were a slave-owning tribe. You had slave-owning Indian tribes. And so you had within, say, Indian country, you had northern Indians and southern Indians that fought each other. And you also, because the federal authority had kind of vanished from the territory, it also made the sedentary farming Indians just dead meat for Comanche raiding parties, Kiowa raiding parties, Apache raiding parties. You had so the neglect, if you will, of the Indian territories and the Indian question and everything else that had been preoccupying the country right before the war introduced this entirely different world. And one of the things that was left when the federal authorities went away were these militias. And these militias were like, they were the worst human beings. They were just the worst human beings. They were people who couldn't be in the army, or were washed out of the army, or deserted from the army. And so the Sand Creek Massacre, most famous massacre of Indians in American history in Colorado, by Chivington, those were the militia guys. So you had not only Indian against Indian, but you had these militias then moving against Indian tribes. To answer your question, so what's the second question?
Do you think there is a credible link between the North American Apaches, Comanches, and the American Indian cultures of Mexico?
Well, if we looked at the origins of Comanches, such as we know them to be, are you would have their great ancestors coming across on a land bridge, and then you would have a tribe living, as far as we know, in the Wind River Mountains of what is now Wyoming, in that area. And that when they got a hold of this piece of technology that was very transformative for them, called the horse, and they became the masters and the greatest horse tribe. When they got the horse and they started to move south, challenging for the supremacy, challenging for essentially the supremacy over the greatest hunting grounds on the continent, which were, think Amarillo, the South Plains. As they came south, they nearly committed genocide on the Apaches, among others. But when they finally kind of arrive in their full power, in their 250,000 square mile empire there in the Southern Plains, this would be the late 18th century. As far as I know, that migration was entirely from the north. Now, the Comanche's favorite raiding place was Mexico. They were always down in Mexico. So there was a great deal of kind of communication back and forth, I think cultural and genetic also with Mexico. I don't know if that answers the question. I probably don't know as much about the Apache background, but that would be, the Comanches would be primarily from the north, as far as I know, going back as far as anyone knows.
Okay. Another question, this one came in from the Zoom Q&A, and it's from James Dennis, who is also an author. Sam, I wonder if you could talk about the legacy of the concept of total war and its impact upon Southern resistance after the war ended.
It's a really good question. Total war is a concept that it has different meanings. It has a different meaning now than it did in the 19th century. The total war as we know it in the 20th century would be the firebombing of Dresden by the Allies, where they deliberately killed innocent men, women, and children. Or the firebombing of Tokyo by the Allies, where they deliberately killed innocent men, women, and children. Or most spectacularly, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That would be total war, where it's war directly on people, not on military targets. What Sherman introduced, Sherman was the theorist. So there's different terms that you can replace total war, because Sherman never advocated that we were just going to go kill civilians, and that's not what anybody did. Some civilians did get killed, but it was not a war against civilians. It was a war against in Sherman's configuration, it was a war against their property. That what Sherman was going to do was essentially mean that the war, that for a Southerner, the war was the equivalent of individual ruin. He's going to just, if you're Phil Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley, you're just going to burn absolutely everything to the ground. So there's no chickens, no eggs, no fence posts, no cows, no grain, nothing left, just a charred landscape. So complete destruction of property, meaning that suddenly you're homeless and you're broke. That was the kind of message. That was what Sherman stood for, and that is what again, we were talking before about what was unleashed by this Confederate unwillingness to lose, if you will, or to surrender, to do anything. Was one of these things was this war. Again, Sherman's the main theorist of and poster boy for. It turned the war so bitter. I mean, when we have all this better, again, it's the thing that struck me the most about the last year of the war when I started thinking about it was just how bitter and vengeful and cruel it was. And so, yes, you have this destruction of the economy, which is just going on, independent of Sherman, whatever destruction. You have prisoner of war camps. You have these massacres going on of black soldiers in the war, and you have, and overlaid on all this, you have these, Sherman is marching to demonstrate to the South that he's just going to burn the place to the ground if they don't surrender. I think it had an enormous effect on the mentality of the nation as it went forward. And I think there was an idea, you know, and in fact, there was a bit of that was myth. I mean, we've now kind of sorted out exactly what Sherman and Sheridan did from what the myth was about what they did, you know, raping tens of thousands of women. That didn't happen. This was absolute God's truth well into the 20th century in the South. So it was partly the actual stuff that they did. And they also, when they went to North Carolina, they really did, Georgia was very restrained compared to what they did in South Carolina, rather. But I think that both the myth and the reality of what they did, you know, conditioned pretty much everything about the Southern point of view after the war. And it cemented in them a feeling that this feeling that the North was just plain evil, that who would do such a thing? Who would ever do such a thing? And I think that as we move, well, I'm not going to get moving into Reconstruction and so forth, but it really did condition the mindset of the South after the war.
Oh, you're muted, Karen.
Hello, Karen? Is Karen there?
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and we received one from email. Are there other resources for making the connection between the end of war migration of freed slaves to commodities across our nation, particularly Texas, and their roles chronicled in the Civil War? I asked this question because my husband, Texas Historical Commission steward, has been in the middle of preserving history and legacy of Black families in Texas, particularly in the Texas Hill Country, beginning with the Wren Cemetery.
That's it's hard for me to remember the question in there. Karen, do you have a sense of what the question?
I guess the first part of it, let me go back to just the first part of it. Are there other resources for making the connection between the end of war migration of freed slaves to communities across our nation, particularly Texas?
Yeah, I would not be the best one to, you know, yes, there are plenty of resources on that. I can't cite them for you right now, but it's a really interesting, the immediate migrations are interesting, and then the subsequent migrations are interesting. It's one of the most fascinating parts of American history, I think, is what happens after the war to former slaves.
One thing you might do is just look for books by a scholar named Bruce Glassrud, Glasrud. He's written extensively on African Americans in Texas and edited all kinds of anthologies, and just kind of like looking at that should point you to some good sources, I think, for further study.
Thank you, Steve. Well, we're at the noon hour, so I wanted to thank everyone for joining us, and especially thank our esteemed authors, S.C. Gwynne and Steve Davis. I really appreciate you spending part of your day with us. As a reminder, if you haven't ordered your books yet, you can still order your books through our website, BoerneBookFest.com. Anyone that orders a book through us, we have signed book plates by the authors that we can include the books. So thank you again, gentlemen. I really appreciate it. This was a fascinating talk, and thank you so much.
Sure thing.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Steve.
Okay. All right. We'll see everybody later. Bye-bye.
Bye.